Welcome to the Savage Show, everybody. Let's get started.
Maybe in the last minute of your life, you want to be something more than a goddamn savage!
Annunziare mendatio. Prego sum homo indomitus.
Fearless rats, insanity. He watches the game fantasy. Radio one, forbidden sight. He searches under of the shadows and
You like this? Oh, you like being food for the immortal?
What is happening, my savage friends? What is happening, my savage friends? You are listening to the voice of Immortal COIL, your whiskey minister of apparently death today. I'd like to invite you to hold high whatever it is you are imbibing and join me in the savage salute. Here's to us, what is like us, not a goddamn thing. Tastes like holy fire. We are at the Savage Show would like to remind you that this broadcast is not for children. This channel contains strong language, sensitive subject matter, images, and content intended for a mature, 18 years or older audience. Viewer discretion is advised. This video contains copywritten content, however, under the Fair Use Act, Section 504C2, Title 17 of the United States Code. This content is presented for the purposes of education and entertainment through the use of parody, satire, critique, analysis, and/or social commentary by means of subjective opinion. Which means pull on your fireproof panties, kids. It's going to be a hot one. Welcome in, welcome in. This is an impromptu stream, so I do not expect anybody to really be lurking about. It is very late on a Sunday or Monday afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from. And I just kind of put this thing together. Like I say pretty much every time I stream, I need to be motivated externally by something extremely important to talk about before I decide to open my app. I'm sure in time that will change. I would love to have a regular schedule. I'd also love to not have to work all night and be a professional insomniac, as it were. But apparently it's good for radio. So what's happening, kids? Good to see you. Good to have you in here. Whether you're listening live or during the replay, we welcome you. We salute you, my savage friends. There's been quite a bit of entertainment coming out lately. A lot of shit has been shoved down our throats. There's been a lot of Disney offerings that have just pretty much sucked. But I'm not here to tell you how much Disney sucks. You already know that. What I am here to talk about is Oppenheimer. Yes, Oppenheimer. J. Robert Oppenheimer, as it were. Um, a lot of the channels are sitting around talking about Barbenheimer. I don't really care about the Barben part. The part that I care about is the savage spirituality that surrounds the entire uh, nuclear atomic, the birth of the atomic age, as it were, exploding onto the scene. Um, there's a lot to unpack there. Um, and I will speak about the movie a little bit. I did enjoy it. I did enjoy it quite a bit. I do want to present a lot of the other stuff first before I talk to you guys about, how the movie was. Because I think that the movie is actually more of a signpost, and it got my wheels spinning. Christopher Nolan is a very good visual director, as well as a coherent interpreter of what his brother writes. And you can see a little bit of the Batman in there, but not distractingly so. It was more like photographic techniques and tempo, and of course some of the actors there. But no, I'm actually more excited to talk about the actual Philadelphia experiment. And I saw this thing last, and I was like, yeah, I guess I could like stream about it a little bit, but it can't be like a straight up fucking movie review because I know too much tangential things that are attached to this whole thing, and some dead bird whispered in my ear, "This might make a good Savage show." And sure enough, so I put together a little thumbnail and I went to Twitter to tweet it out, and then suddenly there's this whole like X fucking thing staring at me. And I look at my phone now, and the place where the bird used to be, there's this like black and white X, and I'm just like, shit, this looks like a fucking porn site on my phone. You know, I don't keep my porn in that site. Um, but I'm also not here to bemoan the choices of a auteur billionaire. Um, what I am here to talk about is the human race and the experience of nuclear war. I was born in the 80s, and my parents both grew up in the atomic age. And I was still in grade school shown a lot of the old black and white duck and cover kind of if the world explodes, your school desk somehow is going to protect you. Um, so it was a very real thing. My father worked in the Air Force. He had clearance to load nukes onto fighter jets. He actually ran drills quite often to do that. And then once he got promoted, he was teaching other younger guys how to do that. So all of this stuff was very real and present. And really, up until the early 90s, when the Berlin Wall fell, everybody felt a uh, tension. And my parents were both children whenever the whole Cuban Missile thing went on. But the reality of that situation did echo down through time. And it's interesting to see this movie, Oppenheimer, uh, which treated very it treated very uh, far out concepts to most boots on earth these days. I was talking about this last podcast. As I grew personally as a teenager um, in the 90s, and uh, I made rapid progress as far as my digestion and understanding and incorporation of who I was as a spiritual being, why I chose to incarnate as a physical being, and then uh, ultimately what I could do with this amassed talent. And I knew I always wanted to be a communicator or an artist in some way. And I'm figuring out ways to do all that through various media, um, to sort of come together and reflect what I have absorbed in my walk on this planet. Um, these streams, I hope, ultimately get listened to by many, many people. But ultimately, I'm talking to my daughter. So this is for you, Lyra. Um, but at the same time, I was thinking that other people were making similar progress in life, or at least that enough people were walking the walk that uh, a critical mass, if you'll forgive the term, could be reached. Um, but as I've gotten into, my 30th, my 40th year here on the planet, and seeing the efforts to sort of double down the dumbness, it's kind of like the 80s and 90s kids have been written off by the powers that were, so they're going after the kids. And this is what's interesting. So you have a double feature like Barbie and Oppenheimer. So it's like, okay, let's take the kids to go see something stupid and vapid and filled with the message, and then let's let the adults sort of ponder, which is very much illustrative of the generational gap going on, especially when you have kids whose witty retort is the word boomer as we stare at a nuclear explosion and fail to realize what um, the greatest generation and their descendants, their immediate generation following the boomers, had achieved in the world in terms of vanquishing tyranny and ensuring freedom. And this did not come without the cost of bloodshed, no. But there is a very great danger of it all slipping away. And a lot of these people are falling, slipping back into sleep. The sound of the sound of a lullaby, the drug soma, as it were. But yeah, humans and atomic war, nuclear war, are very closely intertwined. And I'm not just talking about the modern era. Everything since 1945 has been thrilling. But there is an argument to be made for ancient nuclear warfare occurring on the face of our planet, in which humans weren't necessarily the active instigators, but we very certainly were the victims. What am I talking about? Well, the ancient texts of, the holy texts and the texts of the Near East are rife with examples of tragic conflicts which suggest nuclear war. And it's not just stories in an old dusty book taught to you in a cold brick building. No, there have actually been measurements taken at certain specific sites where radiation is still present and things will not grow and the earth is still out of whack. And yes, there's even physical scars that we will eventually point to as we explore this topic. It's the kind of thing that'll make you drink. But it's very important to understand why the possession of nuclear arms is such a topic of high gravity, with especially in the possession of human hands. We'll talk about ancient incidences. We'll talk about the modern development of the weapons and the deployment of them by the United States. We'll talk about the standoff as countries went nuclear and we all had the guns pointed at each other. And then we'll talk about off-world interest. So we'll go ahead and get started. Whoever that is watching, go ahead and thumbs this up. I appreciate that. We need to get the algorithm up and out there. I'm not gonna be as popular as Joe Rogan right away, but it's like I said, it's an organic process. You know, life has to suggest something, and it has to be lived through in order for whatever I have in my head rattling around to not sound like a topic of the week, simply because, let's talk about tarot cards today. The first example that I want to go through as far as ancient recordings that can be interpreted as nuclear warfare occurs in the Torah, in the book of Genesis. It's not the oldest, but it's probably the one that's most familiar to us if you're listening from, like I am, I'm based out of North America, and if you're based out of Europe or based out of whatever, the Torah is mighty accessible. We'll get into some more esoteric things later, but right now we'll examine this for good measure. In the book of Genesis, chapter 19, we hear a story of two angels who come to the city of Sodom. And this is where a lot of people want to interpret shit sideways. I'm not here to argue about if it's okay to be gay or not. I'm here to talk about the physical act of destruction that occurred at this city and at Gomorrah. How the texts describe it, and a potential victim. Let's listen. So, basically two heavenly beings, which the Bible always translates as angels, which the literal translation would be messengers, and the actual word in Hebrew is malachim. Okay, but basically two strange heavenly beings arrive, and everybody recognizes them as not human right away. No questions asked. And indeed, if you think about our modern concepts of beings from beyond the realm of Earth, a lot of us immediately go to something that looks very not human. And it either has scales, or usually it has a big bubble head and two big silly eyes. What they looked like back then is anybody's guess. They didn't really leave pictures in the Bible at that point. But basically, these two beings come into the house of a man named Lot, or at least this is how it's been recorded and passed down to it. His name could have been fucking anything, but we remember him as Lot. And basically, there's a commotion, and these two emissaries were sent out by, it always says the Lord in big capital letters, but whenever you read the word Lord, it stands for Elohim, which is a plural, meaning the gods. So these two emissaries are sent forth by the gods to ascertain if anybody of these cities are worthy of being spared. Because it's like one of these, like, God is wrathful and we're going to fuck shit up. And then everybody, the voice of dissent goes, well, what if there's like good people down there? What if they're not all just assholes? And God's like, okay, if you can go down there and find somebody who's not an asshole, then we'll hold this thing off until they can clear out. And that's basically what happens. These two malachim identify Lot as somebody who's not an asshole, a biblical asshole. You guys, there's lots of biblical assholes. Apparently, Lot was not one of them. Good job, Lot. Good job. And these two Malachim tell him, look, this place is going to go up in flames. You need to get the fuck up out if you care about your life and your well-being right now. Do you have any, wives or brothers or kids or anybody else who should come along? And Lot's like, yeah, I got a crew. So Lot basically gathers up his people, and the two Malachim clear his way. There was a commotion at his door, and we all know the nature of that commotion. It's very controversial, but it's one of those things. It's one of those. I saw that my mic came undone. I don't know how long that was undone for, but we're talking about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The two Malachim take Lot and say, get your family, get the fuck up out. And you ride until you reach the fucking mountains and you don't look back, because this place is gone. It's already done. It's already been decided. And he goes, okay. So the two Malachim clear the way for him in terms of slaying dead bodies. Yeah. Slaying bodies dead. Well, slay your body dead good. That's their slogan. And then the actual language is what I wanted to read to you guys. Because again, we're citing instances of ancient nuclear war upon the face of the planet Earth as we know it. So let's see here. Okay. This is Genesis 19, verse 23. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar, which was his fuck off point. That's his fade back point. That's far enough away that he's not going to get repercussions from what's about to happen, which sounds a lot like get the fuck back from ground zero. Okay. 24. Then Elohim, it says the Lord, but Elohim rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Elohim out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. Okay. Now there's a lot to unpack there. Because again, I believe Genesis is simultaneously one of the oldest mytho-historical texts that modern society carries with it. But at the same time, it reads like science fiction in certain places, and especially in places like this. When it says brimstone and fire, you look at ancient paintings and they're literally showing like flaming cobbles of fucking what's his name from Thor falling upon these cities, and like people going, oh no, throwing up their hands in fear or whatever. But how would you describe a nuclear fucking explosion if all your reference point was tending sheep and filling clay vessels with water and going out and like cutting wheat and that kind of thing? Furthermore, how would you describe having to get far enough away from all that shit so that you were not affected by it? And then furthermore, if you're the dude who housed these two emissaries and told to leave because some shit's happening, how do you digest all that? Because you got to think like all the shit took place, and he lived to talk about it, but how do you describe it? And he did the best he could, and whoever listened to that did the best they could, all the way up until the guy whose quill touched the fucking paper. And he had to describe it somehow. You know, and it's funny because a lot of, like, especially the first 5 books in the Torah, they existed as oral tradition or song or poetry or prose or something for thousands of years before they were actually written down. And the tribe of, the Hebrew, they were enslaved a couple times, so it was like reinterpreted in a couple of different ways. And it's funny because Genesis is not the only text that speaks of this sort of warfare, but it is, like I say, very present in our culture, and especially the way that these verses are used to justify or regulate certain aspects of human behavior. Um, and then the illustration of fire and brimstone and how that translates into divine retribution if you're unholy, and especially in the hereafter, as it were. There is one other um, one other like little fascinating thing in this chapter 19, and it is verse 26. It talks about Lot leaving, and it talks about fire and brimstone and the cities, and then nothing grew upon the ground. And then it says, but Lot's wife, his wife, looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. A pillar of salt, which makes no goddamn sense. If you'll forgive the turn of phrase. Becoming a pillar of salt makes no goddamn sense. But this is also one of those instances where I believe that biblical mistranslations were allowed to proceed into the English version of King James so as to disguise what really happened, and or to hide it, to shroud it in darkness, as it were, whereas only the illuminated could be taught the proper meaning. We're going to invoke the name of Mr. Zechariah Sitchin, our favorite Sumerologist, as it were. Whether or not you believe he's full of shit, and I don't think he's completely correct, but I think he's largely correct. Let's say he's between 80 to 90% correct. If only 10% of what he has to say is wrong, that means the rest of it is likely true. Because this is a guy who dug through 100 years of literature before he put, pen to paper or his knobby little fingers on a keyboard, and presented quite the interpretation of a lot of shit. But what he had to say about verse 26 was that, again, like I was saying, the way that this came to the English book is not what the original Hebrew said. The words in Hebrew, he said, roughly translated to Lot's wife tarried, like in the sense that she stalled or she went back for something. And it's typical woman. I forgot my hair comb. I forgot my brush. I forgot my purse. Let's turn around. Let's go back. He's like, we don't got time, woman. She's like, okay, I'll catch up with you later. So she tarried and became a pillar of salt. That's not what Sitchin says. He says that the word in Hebrew for salt can also be translated as the word vapor. So if we look at verse 26 and think of it in terms of Lot's wife tarried and became vaporized, that makes a lot more sense, especially considering what we know about what happened to the people of Hiroshima I wish I could say it like a Japanese person, like Hiroshima. But I sound like I'm sneezing, so I won't say it like that. Instantly vaporized. I mean, there's stories about people who were so close to ground zero that their bodies were instantly incinerated and the only thing left of them was the shadow on the wall. I don't know if any of those walls have been left standing. I know that there's a national monument over there, um, as it should be, but I don't know if they left any of those bricks like that that contained people's shadows. So Lot is told to gather his family and get the fuck up out. His wife tarries and is vaporized. Okay. Now there's a thing that happened in the annals of Lot, but that is one of those instances where if you just kind of stretch your thinking a little bit, the text reveals something bigger than what happened or than what is commonly the subject requires a lot of liquid reinforcement. But it's not the only example. It's not the only compelling example. There is another tradition in human records that suggests that a nuclear calamity happened upon the face of the earth. And the source of it is a text known as, well, a group of texts known as the Vedas, where they describe different types of weapons that were used by the gods against well, the bad guys. Let's not get too far into that because the Vedas are very expansive. We could literally spend like an entire broadcast just introducing them. There is a city known as Mohenjo-Daro that was located in the country of Pakistan, so the subcontinent of India. And before all these political divisions, or it's not even political divisions, it's religious divisions. I mean, the history of that place is fucking crazy. You got Hindus that believe one thing, you got Muslims that believe something else, you got conquerors that believe something other than that, and they all decided to get together and fight over the same little strip of land. But there's a place called Mohenjo-Daro where there was evidence of it thriving, and then suddenly it was wiped out. And they even found like skeletons that had been blown over as by the wind, and it was abandoned for a long time. Nobody went there. And when they finally dug it up, they were astonished by these things. This is an article from, let's see. Well, it's from ancientorigins.net, and I don't need to read the whole thing to you because sometimes these things turn into an episode of fucking ancient aliens. Pertinent things are there was a British Indian researcher named David Davenport who spent 12 years studying ancient Hindu scripts and evidence at Mohenjo-Daro, which he presented in his book Atomic Destruction in 2000 BC. He found objects at the site which appeared to be fused. He found pieces of desert glass, which could only be produced by heats as high as 1500 degrees Celsius, which is different than Fahrenheit. Okay? Get out your little calculators and punch that equation in. Fuck, maybe I'll even punch it for you. Convert 1500 C2 Fahrenheit. Let's see what the internet spits out. That is 2,732 degrees Fahrenheit. Can't make glass without that much heat. Followed by a sudden cooling. So it's not like blowing glass. It's like everything's hot, then everything's not. And he said within the city itself, David Davenport seemed to find an epicenter that was about 50 yards wide, within which everything was crystallized, fused, or melted. And 60 yards from the center, the bricks were melted on one side, which indicates a blast. There's another researcher, A. Gorbovsky, in his book Riddles of Ancient History, who reported the discovery of at least one human skeleton in that area with a level of radioactivity approximately 50 times greater than it should have been due to natural radiation. So Davenport claimed that what was found at Mohenjo-Daro corresponds exactly to what was seen at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So, of course, all the, regular science people are going to shit all over that idea, and they're going to say, you're just making shit up, and, if one guy had radiation, how come all the guys didn't have radiation? And we learned from Hiroshima, Nagasaki. We learned from those two incidences, and especially like it's been decades since, it's almost been 100 years since then. And they've done generational studies by now. We learned even that at ground zero, not everybody was affected by radiation in the same way. Some people like fucking died, and some people like died weeks later, and some people got sick, but then they got okay. After I saw Oppenheimer, I actually went on this big fucking nuclear weapons kick and researched all these things. I don't necessarily want to like dissect all that to a high degree at this point, but the fact that there were people who were instantly killed and other people who should have been killed but lived like, long and healthy lives after they recovered from their terrible burns, is indication that our physiology adapts differently to it. There is a far out theory that suggests, and I forgot where I read it. It was one of the hippie books that I used to read in the 1990s, and supposedly exposure to nuclear incidences helped create the different races of human being. Now, I'm not so 100% certain on that. I'm sure it didn't help, but I think it's more likely that encounters with different extraterrestrial civilizations account for that more so than exposure to nuclear weapons. So that's the description of Mohenjo-Daro. And the passage from the Mahabharata that I would like to quote for you here is a translation by Mr. Eric von Daniken in his book, Chariots of the Gods. It's another one of those books like him and Sitchin really carved out a special little place in space and time. His description of the terrible weapon is as follows. It was a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame, as bright as the 1,000 suns, rose in all its splendor. I think I probably read that a little bit too low for dramatic effect, but let's read it a little bit quicker. An incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as the 1,000 suns rose in all its splendor. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Varishnis and the Andakhas. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. The hair and the nails fell out, pottery broke without apparent cause, and the birds turned white. Because they were racist. Those racist fucking birds. God damn it. They're probably misogynists too. It continues. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. To escape from this fire, the soldiers threw themselves in streams to wash themselves and their equipment, which is also consistent with reports from Hiroshima. There was a guy that I was reading about specifically who apparently was within 500 yards of the blast, but he was behind like some impressive concrete, and he was still burned, and he jumped in a river to try to wash himself off. But then he was actually like sucked out and thrown into a potato field. You can't make the stuff up. And especially the 1945 incident, because it's on record. The guy was actually given like an honorific by the Japanese government because he survived both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'll have to look that up at some point. But suffice it to say that this passage from the Mahabharata, which was written between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, very much describes the after effects of nuclear radiation. And it's interesting to try to call it to classify it as a divine weapon. When we could not build those things until, almost 80 years ago, like 78 years ago. It's very interesting stuff. So next, I would like to present you, as we consider this topic of a nuclear war on ancient Earth. Because I watched Oppenheimer. I'd like to share this screen here. Gonna have to stop this one so you can look at my skull. Okay. This is a satellite image. This was taken back in the 70s, perhaps 70s or 80s. This is before flat Earth people decided that NASA didn't know what the fuck they were talking about. This, my savage friends, is a area of land known as the Sinai Peninsula, or Sinai, or however you want to say it. Popeye, this eye, that eye. It is remarkable for a few different reasons. There's a section in this other place that I wanted to highlight as I read this. There is an interesting interpretation, again, by no other than Mr. Zechariah Sitchin. And if you look in the center of this landmass of the Sinai Peninsula, you will see concentric rings. And I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 of them. And what Mr. Sitchin says is that this is an area that has been scarred by nuclear weapons in the ancient past. So much so that the land has been flattened and that nothing will grow there, and that they find glass in the desert. They find areas where it's highly irradiated for inexplicable reasons. You have places like the Dead Sea, who's so fucking salty that, animals can't live there. And you just have this big old fucking nothing that people used to dread to cross in order to go from, if you look to the right of the Sinai Peninsula, that's Africa. And if you look to the left, that's Saudi Arabia, right? This is where you're either going to believe Sitchin or not. In the ancient Sumerian text, there is a land known as Dilmun, Tilman, or Mun, depending on how you want to pronounce it. This was a zone that was reserved solely for the gods. No human city could exist there, and humans indeed were denied access to Dilmun. I believe Gilgamesh tried to enter it, and he was greeted by some kind of robot monster guardian thing. But this realm of the gods was a place that only, not just the chief deities, but the Anunnaki or the Ajiji. When they're in space, they're called Ajiji, and when they're on Earth, they're called Anunnaki. Ajiji means those who watch from above, which is interesting because the Egyptians call their gods Neter, which also means those from above who watch. Anunnaki means those who from heaven are upon the earth, right? So you're in space, you're a Gigi. You're on Earth, you're Anunnaki. Same people, though. Okay. Let's see here. My roommates are making noise. Hang on. Stand by. Okay, thanks for standing by. I got thin walls here. So to take the exact words of Sitchin, this is from the Lost Realms. It says, soon the gods were back in council, for even Enki knew not the exact hiding place of the ultimate weapons. To his surprise, not all the other gods were as shocked as he was. Enki spoke strongly against the idea, urging steps to stop Nergal for the use of the weapons. He pointed out, quote, the lands would make desolate, and the people will make perish. Nanar knew too, wavered as Enki spoke, but Enlil and Inerta were for divisive action, and so, with the council of the gods in disarray, the decision was left to Anu. So it's always the gods discussing the fates of, earthlings. But it's interesting because in this book, Sitchin is saying that it wasn't the earthlings necessarily who were, not all of them, who were the target of these proposed nuclear strikes. What he's saying actually was this land of Dilmun was taken over by an entity that was later recalled by Babylonians as Marduk, and that Sitchin equates Marduk with the creation of the Tower of Babel. So all of these things were not cool in the eyes of the senior Anunnaki, right? So they're like, we're gonna just fucking nuke the place. If this guy's gonna be an asshole like that, we'll just blow the whole fucking thing up, and he can't even go back there for 100 years or whatever. Sitchin continues, when Ninurta finally arrived to uh, the lower world, right? He's up in heaven talking to the gods, and then he goes back down to the lower world with word of Amnu's decision. He found out that Nergal had actually already ordered the priming of the 7 awesome weapons with their poisons, which Sitchin emphasizes as their nuclear warheads. Although the Era Epic, which is where we're citing, the source that we're citing when we're reading out the Enki and Enlil and blah, 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 was referring to Ninurta by the epithet of Ishom, the Scorcher. It details in great detail how Ninurta had made clear to Nergal or Ara as the weapons could be used only against specifically approved targets, that before they could be used, the Anunnaki gods at the selected sites and the Ajiji gods up in the sky and going to and from had to be forewarned. And last but not least, mankind had to be spared, for Anu, Lord of the gods, on the land had pity. The words of Ninurta finally swayed Nergal. He heard the words spoken by Ushum, the Scorcher, Ninurta. The words appealed to him as fine oil. Interesting metaphor. Agreeing to leave alone the seas, to leave Mesopotamia out of the attack, he formulated a modified plan. The destruction would be selective. The tactical aim would be to destroy the cities where Nabu might be hiding. Nabu. The strategic aim would be to deny Marduk his greatest prize, the spaceport. This is Sitchin's words. I think that in 2023 retrospect, some of his things were simple, but again, like just like the ancients only had like sheeps and plows to look at, Sitchin only had like 70s and 80s tech to look at when he was writing this shit. The place from where the great ones ascend. So, with one nuclear weapon, the spaceport was obliterated. The mount within which its controls were hidden were smashed, and the plane that served as its runways were obliterated. It was a destructive feat, the written record of tests performed by Ninurta, or in his epithet, the Scorcher Ishum. Now it was the turn of Nergal to give vent to his vow of vengeance, guiding himself from the Sinai Peninsula, that's what we're looking at here, to the Canaanite cities by following the king's highway. Era upheavaled them. The words employed by the Era epic are almost identical to those used in the biblical tale of Sodom and Gomorrah. The verses that follow may well describe the creation of the new southern portion of the Dead Sea by breaking through its southern shoreline, right? Then it cites more text. The deed performed by the 2 gods, Ninurta and Nergal, when the Anunnaki guarding the spaceport forewarned, had to escape by ascending into the dome of heaven, and was recalled in a Babylonian text in which one king recalled the momentous event that had taken place, quote, in the reign of an earlier king. Thus was the spaceport, the prize over which so many of the wars of the gods had been fought, obliterated. The great place was never to be seen again, but the scar, and that's the picture that we have up right now, the scar made on the face of the earth that awesome day can still be seen to this very day. It is a vast scar, so vast that its features can be seen only from the skies, revealed only in recent years as satellites begin to photograph the earth. It is the scar for which no scientist has hitherto offered an explanation. The limestone mountains loom white on the horizon, but where the great central plain adjoins the immense scar in the Sinai, the hue of the plain, black, stands out in sharp contrast to the surrounding whiteness. So you can see the darkened areas, whereas everything else looks white and sandy, according to Sitchin. Black is not a natural hue in the Sinai Peninsula. I just read that. The redness of the sandstone combined to dazzle the eye with hues ranging from bright yellow to light gray and dark brown, but nowhere the black which comes in nature from basalt stones. Yet here, in the central plain of the north-northwest of the enigmatic giant scar, the soil's color is a black hue. It is caused, as the photograph clearly shows, by millions upon millions of bits and pieces of blackened rock, strewn as by a giant hand over the whole area. No explanation unless one reads the verses of the ancient texts and accepts our conclusion, and that's Sitchin and Sitchinites, that in the days of Abraham, Nergal and Ninurta wiped out the spaceport that was there with nuclear weapons. And the spaceport and the evil cities were no more. But far away to the west, in the land of Sumer itself, the nuclear blasts and their brilliant flashes were neither felt nor seen. But the deed done by Nergal and Ninurta had not gone unrecorded, for it turned out to have had a most profound effect on Sumer, its people, and its very existence. The nuclear explosion gave rise to an immense wind, a radioactive wind, which began as a whirlwind. And then the radioactive whirlwind began to spread and move westward with the prevailing winds towards the Mediterranean. Sumer itself became the ultimate nuclear victim. So in a sense, he's talking about nuclear fallout, the radioactive cloud or whatever. So they talk about acid rain, they talk about, isotopes raining down on the face of the earth. Well, if it's a windy fucking day, it's not going to fall straight down, is it? He is saying that following this detonation in the Sinai Peninsula, that the wind blew it to the land of Mesopotamia. And onto the land of Sumer, this is from the text, from the ancient text. On the land of Sumer fell a calamity, one unknown to man, one that had never been seen before, one that could not be withstood. The people, terrified, could hardly breathe. An evil wind clutched them. It does not grant them another day. Mouths were drenched in blood, heads wallowed in blood. The face was made pale by the evil winds. And listen, if you are somebody from the Middle East and your face turns pale, you're in trouble, dude. And though the people were baffled, the gods knew the cause of the evil wind. An evil blast heralded the baleful storm. An evil blast, the forerunner of the baleful storm was. Mighty offspring, valiant sons were the heralds of the pestilence. That sounds like Master Yoda talking, huh? Now, here's what's interesting, because there's what Sitchin has to say, which is compelling. But what Sitchin has to say is his interpretation of ancient texts that were discovered in the libraries of King Ashurbanipal of Babylonia. Now, he was a conqueror and all that shit, but he was also a scholar. So he had his scholars record everything that he could possibly find, even texts that were copied directly from Sumerian cuneiform, which was different than what the Babylonians spoke. But back then, Sumerian was kind of like how Latin is today. It's like it's a dead language that's spoken because everybody understands it. But since it's no longer spoken by living people, it's not going to change. So that's why we name dinosaurs in Latin names, because Latin's not going to change anymore, right? There is a city known as Ur. I'm going to kill this image of the Sinai Peninsula. There is a city known as Ur. And it's most famous for its ziggurat, which to this very day dominates the sky in the local area. And actually, Saddam Hussein, when he was ruling Iraq, he actually was trying to reconstruct the ziggurat at Ur, because I think he wanted to proclaim himself the heir to Nebuchadnezzar. All this kind of shit. Saddam was a weird fucker. But the lamentation of Ur describes an evil wind. It also describes conditions that, just like the Mahabharata, very much, if you think about it from a modern perspective, bespeak the aftermath of the unleashing of nuclear weapons. Nuclear war always makes me thirsty. Okay. Okay. So the lamentation of Ur, right? The lament for Ur is a clay tablet that's in a museum. You can look it up, you can read it yourself, and this is not coming from, Joe Dickhead watches UFOs late at night.com. This is coming from like, Oxford, right? This is a translation coming from the website of Oxford. So again, the texts open with descriptions of the gods discussing the fate of the city, and it's very much in the sense of what we were talking about before. Sitchin was pulling from two different texts to sort of um, cite the sources for the conclusions he was coming to. So the era epic, which we were just discussing, that's everything that happened before this, was talking about the gods trying to solve a problem of somebody who didn't belong where they were by destroying the infrastructure in the area where he didn't belong with nuclear weapons. And then after that decision was made and communicated, everybody on the ground who was Anunnaki had to leave because they didn't want to get caught up in the blast. And everybody who was in the sky, the Ajiji, also had to leave. Right? So this text, the lament for Sumer, for Ur, begins with the gods coming back and surveying the damage that happened after the prevailing winds had spread nuclear radiation to the land of Sumer. And Ur was one of the cities that fell. It's it's one of those things that scholars attribute to like neighboring tribes, like in Europe we have like the Visigoths and the Huns, and they're all coming over the hill to take down Rome, and they're saying something like that happened. It's like, no, Sumer was like cool for a couple thousand years, but then the Hittites and the Babylonians overran them. But what these texts are saying, if you look at them the way that Sitchin wants you to look at them, is that the cities became unlivable and were abandoned. The people of Sumer were like city folk, and because of all the shit they had to leave, nobody could live in Ur for thousands of years. I don't think anybody goes there anymore except for like tourists. And it's the same thing. Ur was abandoned and covered over by sand. They had to like spend 10 years or whatever digging it out. And then Saddam like had to wait until the 1980s to actually start building shit on top of it. So yeah, the texts talk about the gods returning and finding just horror all around them. The part that I want to read to you, and like I said, this is Oxford, so they have numbered the lines of the tablet. And this comes from beginning at line 479. There is lamentation in the haunted city. Mourning reeds grow there. And it's not mourning like the dawn, it's mourning like funeral. In its midst, there is lamentation. Mourning reeds grew there. Its people spend their days moaning. Like, woe is me. O bitter storm, retreat, O storm. Storm, return to your home. O storm that destroys cities, retreat, O storm. Storm, return to your home. O storm that destroys houses, retreat, O storm. Storm, return to your home. Indeed, the storm that blew on Sumer blew also on the foreign lands. Indeed, the storm that blew on the land blew on the foreign lands. It has blown on to Tidnum. It has blown on the foreign lands. It has blown on and get to him. It has blown on the foreign lands. This might have been a song. It was blown on to Onken. It has blown on to the foreign lands. It leveled Onken like a blowing evil wind. Famine has overwhelmed the evildoer. Those people have been made to submit. May Anu not change the divine powers of heaven, the divine plans for treating the people with justice. May Anu not change the decisions and judgments to lead to the people properly, to travel the roads of the land. May An not change it. May An and Enlil not change it. And this is like people like bewailing the loss of their city. So I'm just reading it kind of like academically, but these people are like screaming. They're like, "Ugh." And it's just like people like crying out to the Virgin fucking Mary or whoever. May Enki and Nema not change it. May An not change it. That the Tigris and Euphrates should again carry water. May An not change it. That there should be rain in the skies and on the ground speckled barley. May An not change it. That there should be water courses with water and fields with grain. May An not change it. That the marshes should support fish and fowl. May An not change it. That old reeds and fresh reeds should grow in the reed beds. May An not change it. May An and Enlil not change it. May Enki and Nema not change it. So they're saying that their city is not as it should be. They're saying that, let's see here. Line 389, in the city, those who had not been felled by weapons succumbed to hunger. Hunger filled the city like water, it would not cease. This hunger contorted people's faces, twisted their muscles. Its people were as if drowning on a pond. They gasped for breath. The dogs of Ur no longer sniff at the base of the city wall. This is line 350. The man who used to drill large wells scratches the ground at the marketplace. Line 328. There were no paths on either of its banks. Long grass grew there. The reed fence of the well-stocked cattle pen was split open. Reed huts were overrun. Their walls were breached. It's just desolate. In Ur, no one went to fetch food. No one went to fetch water. Their strength ebbed away. They could not even go on their way. The city was affected by an evil famine. It was affected. The city was affected with that which destroys cities, which destroys houses. He afflicted the city with that which could not be withstood with weapons. He affected the city. Well, suffice it to say, it was destroyed. And these people are crying. These people are just lamenting the loss of their city. So humans have carried stories like this with them for thousands of years. And the things that occurred in these cities upon the face of the earth could not be comprehended in human terms because we had no context for which to place them in. Context did not arrive until AD 1945. the theoretical genesis of the atomic bomb was a confluence of a bunch of different theories colliding. You had Niels Bohr, who had the theory of the atom. You had Einstein discussing spatial relativity. And you had J. Robert Oppenheimer, who pulled together a team of people to start to work on the creation of the atomic bomb. And it was at the behest of Einstein and Bohr. They wrote a letter to the President of the United States, who I believe was Roosevelt at the time, saying that, look, the science is there for a weapon of unbridled destruction to be created. And if you guys don't build it, the Nazis will. And if you want to know about the Nazis, ask me why I don't live in that part of the world anymore. Ask me why I came to America, essentially. So they said, right, they got on it. Oppenheimer was placed as director. He picked his staff. He built the city of Los Alamos out there, and he put those fuckers to work. It took them about 2.5 years to go from shit on a chalkboard to something that they could test out in the desert. And the image that you're looking at right now is actually a computer, it's like an AI beautification of the Trinity test. The Trinity test was the first nuclear explosion in modern times. And that's what's funny, because Oppenheimer was interviewed years later, and he's very famous for quoting the Mahabharata. Now I am become death, right? Destroyer of worlds. And he was asked, so this is the first time that nuclear weapons have been used on Earth. And he replied, yes, in modern times. And I don't think he was pressed further than that. But it's an interesting foot. Leads me to think that he thinks along the lines of the central point of this broadcast tonight. Excuse me. So the Trinity test took place in New Mexico. And then within 2 weeks, we built 2 bombs. One was a uranium bomb and one was a plutonium bomb. And they were delivered to Asia and unleashed upon Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the morality of that whole thing is still kind of in question. Morals will leave up to you. Whether you think it's right or wrong, whether you think it was justified or not, it did happen. It is what it is. We live in the aftermath of all that. But what is extremely interesting is that following the end of World War II, the United States was the only country in possession of nuclear weapons, at least for the first couple years. The only nuclear weapons capable bombing group existed in Roswell, New Mexico. Does that name sound familiar to you? Well, if not, let me remind you. What I'm going to say is my summarization of something that chiefly was from this book here, The Day After Roswell. This is a very good book. It's one of those books that was it's a firsthand testimony of a very, 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 very high-ranking Army Air Force colonel, and he was around when it was still the Army Air Force, as it split into the Air Force and the Army into two different branches. His name is Philip J. Corso, and he waited until like the late 90s, like until he was like a little old man, basically about to die, to print this book. Because technically, this book reveals classified secrets. But because of what happens following the deployment of nuclear weapons on Earth, everything changes. Suddenly, we go from, okay, let's put it this way. We live in 2023. This all happened in the 1940s. Oppenheimer was writing on the chalkboard and trying to get his team together in 1943. Okay, now that's 80 years. So from 80 years, we went to like I don't know, playing stickball in the fucking street to like the moon and back, and now we all have a personal like hyper intelligent Palm Pilot with the sum total of human knowledge in our fucking hand at all times. I'd have to like sweep up radio stations for 20 years before they'd even let me read commercials 100 years ago. And now like any idiot clearly can get online and do a broadcast. But what Colonel Philip J. Corso, retired, has to say, and I guess I should read a little bit of his resume so that we can give it proper context. This is really an excellent book. I actually have a hardcover that was signed by him, not in person, but I found it at a bookstore, and it was only like $20. So he, that was a treasure. Okay, so let's see here. Military career. So this is the author of the book that's currently on screen. After joining the Army in 1942, Corso served in Army intelligence in Europe, becoming the chief of the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps in Rome. This is verifiable. Pentagon has all his records. In 1945, Corso arranged for the safe passage of 10,000 Jewish World War II refugees out of Rome to the British Mandate. That's great. During the Korean War, Corso performed intelligence duties under General Douglas MacArthur as Chief of Special Projects Branch of the Intelligence Division, Far East Command. One of his primary duties was to keep track of enemy prisoners of war in camps in North Korea. Corso was in charge of investigating the estimated number of U.S. and other United Nations POWs held at each camp and their treatment. At later hearings in 1992 of the Senate Select Committee on POW MIA Affairs, Corso testified that he believed hundreds of American POWs were abandoned at these camps. John McCain, John McCain, right? He was a famous prisoner of war. John McCain stated that his knowledge obtained from those who had personal relationships with Eisenhower led him to believe that Eisenhower was just not capable of allowing known American POWs to remain incarcerated after the termination of the Cold War. So there's a little bit of political disagreement. Corso was on the staff of President Eisenhower's National Security Council for 4 years, from 1953 to 1957. In 1961, and this is what's pertinent to what I'm about to discuss, he became chief of the Pentagon's Foreign Technology Desk in Army Research and Development. Foreign Technology Desk, working under Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau. Okay, so that's some necessary background to say that this colonel wasn't just some desk job guy, although he did do some desk jobs. He was on Eisenhower's staff. He headed the Foreign Technologies Division in 1961. And this is where the story gets interesting. So according to this book, The Day After Roswell, 1947, the only nuclear arms bomber group capable of deployment on the face of planet Earth was located at Roswell, New Mexico. Okay. And as a result, the base was regularly visited by UFOs. Now, let's think about the interest of the off-world observers here. And you have to put on your scientist minds and your, don't just look at it as little green men flying UFOs. Look at it as a scientist considering a problem. And there's ethical dilemmas and there's all kinds of things. So yeah, let's go down and look at what these monkey people are doing. All that stuff we were talking about before about ancient nuclear war and that humans had observed it, humans had been affected by it, humans had been killed by it in the wars of gods, right? For them to have gone from passive observers and unfortunate victims to being capable of deploying the same type of weaponry in the space of about 8,000 years would be very alarming to off-world observers, because suddenly this race possesses the capability of not only destroying themselves, which if we killed all of each other, I mean, it would be sad, but the universe would go on. But more importantly, we could destroy the entire biosphere of planet Earth. If everybody got pissed off at everybody else and decided to hit the big red button, Earth would be uninhabitable for thousands of years. I mean, left to natural causes. I think if that actually happened, and contactees have talked about that, if the human race was to ever destroy itself, like really destroy itself, they'd make room for another sentient race to come through here. It's just too ideal for this part of the galaxy. But I digress. So the 509th Bomber Group out of Roswell was the only nuclear-ready bomber group. So they were being regularly visited by UFOs. And of course, the government knows about UFOs because, Foo Fighters and things like that have been tailed, especially during World War II. There was a lot of heavy UFO activity. And because they were basically flying like bolted together pieces of metal that were propeller driven, of course, you cannot catch real UFOs. Shit, they can't even do that now with like the most modern, advanced, factory ready thing yesterday. But they were trying to see if they were trackable. Now, the British developed radar. Americans were given radar technology and started playing with it. And according to Philip J. Corso, Colonel Philip J. Corso, it was actually radar that brought down the craft that crashed at Corona. Okay. Now, I don't know if like the radar was triangulating on these things and fucked up the wave or whatever the hell happened. But he says it was radar. He was briefed on this. He's not just some yokel. I read you his resume. Okay. 2 craft came down. And this is according to Colonel Corso. There was between 4 and 6 bodies recovered. And possibly 1 living being. And Colonel Corso didn't say one living being. He said bodies, and he said crates containing the bodies. And an order was placed with another fellow named Glenn Dennis, who ran the funeral home, if he can come up with coffins the size of that children would fit in. Glenn Dennis is an interesting fellow. He's dead now, but he has about an hour-long interview if you look on YouTube somewhere. It's very interesting stuff. So 2 craft came down, and it was also like a big rare desert lightning thunderstorm. You know, all these things like contributed to the downing of the craft. But you know, the radar people were used to seeing them and then not seeing them, and sometimes they can get a target lock and sometimes not. Most of the times not. But on this particular night, which the anniversary of it just passed. On this particular night, 2 craft came down the day after Roswell. A rancher named Max Brazel went out and found the first crash site. Right. He didn't say he saw any bodies. He just saw debris. So he went and called the army, like a good little dude, and they sent out what was his name? Jesse Marcel. They sent out Jesse Marcel, and some fucking kid in a Jeep to go and look at the stuff. Word has it that they crated it up and he took some home and he showed some to his kid and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But essentially what happened is that the army came and like cleaned everything up. And part of what they cleaned up were bodies. There was wreckage, and it's kind of like if the main body of the craft had hit something and then pieces of it went everywhere else. So they took all that shit back to the 509th. And then from the 509th, it was sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And then from there, it dispersed, you know, and there's that whole thing about Hangar 18 at Wright-Patterson. Megadeth wrote a whole album about it. But essentially it dispersed and it went to the military industrial complex, right? Advanced fucking craft and bodies of non-terrestrial origin. So, of course, everything had to be kept secret. But the big thing about Roswell was that, you know, the fucking commander there was like, yeah, you know, get on the paper and tell the press that we have a flying saucer. You know, and it was like, hey, the Army Air Force has a saucer out in Roswell. And then his bosses read that and it was like, no, that's no good. So the next day they printed a retraction. Oops, no, it's not a flying saucer, it's a weather balloon. And they actually took Jesse Marcel to pose with a weather balloon and, you know, look like a jerk, basically. Now, from what I understand, a lot of the people in the town of Roswell was threatened never to speak about what happened, or they'll be taken out into the desert and vultures and worms would lick their bones, kind of thing. And it wasn't really talked about until like the 90s, I believe. You know, maybe the late 80s, something like that. But it was a long fucking time. So this is 1947. The assignment to the Foreign Technology Desk in Army Research and Development of Colonel Corso by Lieutenant General Trudeau occurred in 1961. And the thing that he says in his book was that foreign technology was something that could be used as a smokescreen, because say a Russian jet crashed and it crashed in like Alaska, you know, or whatever. The crews that go out and get it would bring it back home. And of course, we'd want to take it apart and figure out what the Russians are up to. So they'd send the material to the foreign technology desk, where they can, measure the differences in the fucking bolts the Russians uses versus ours. And that's well and good. A lot of that did happen. But what Colonel Corso is saying is that he was brought UFO parts. And he was briefed on the Roswell stuff, all the stuff that I just said. But he was actually, his job was to take things that came off of the Roswell craft and try to find ways to integrate it into society for the improvement of our infrastructure, if anything at all was, uh, compatible. I guess that's the best word to say. But apparently, if they're bringing him stuff, somebody deemed it compatible. Now he sorts several things. Bell Labs, he said, sent him a lot of stuff. Hewlett Packard sent him some stuff. So these are companies that, like Eisenhower warned in his farewell address, were part of the military-industrial complex, where things become so compartmentalized. It's like, here, I'm going to give you something. Don't ask where I got it from, but figure the fuck out how it works, and then see if you can do something with it. I'll be back in a week. We'll talk then. So according to Colonel Corso, a few of the things that directly came off of the craft were lasers, fiber optics, integrated circuit chips, and infrared night vision, like the night vision goggles. And he's saying that the night vision goggles were actually reverse engineered by coverings that came off of the being's eyes. So remember I told you, like, bodies were recovered, and apparently the big black eyes aren't really black eyes. Apparently on the eye, sort of like a contact lens, but physiologically shaped for them, there is a black membrane that comes off and can filter out different wavelengths of light. And from that membrane, they developed night vision. Now, I know that sounds pretty fucking wild. That's it's one of those things that it's tempting to say, like, well, I stayed up till 1:30 Pacific Standard Time, Seattle West Coast, and this guy's talking about night vision goggles being made out of the contact lenses of little gray men. And that's something if I'm saying that, but it's different if Colonel Philip J. Corso says it. And I believe that there exists one or two interviews that he gave with Art Bell. Remember Art Bell? I do. Where he gave these interviews in his late 80s, so he sounds like a little old man, but he discusses all of these things in very convincing, proper military language. He was sharp up until the day he died. He wasn't fucking Grandpa Simpson. But yeah, go out on YouTube and see if you can look that shit up. Colonel J. Corso. He's a very fascinating guy. And then it's also interesting that he is discussing things coming off of out of places like Bell Labs and Hewlett Packard, reverse engineered, and see if they can be placed into society. When you compare it to the testimony of guys like Bob Lazar, who was, if you believe his word, and I do, handpicked out of his job at Los Alamos to go and work in Area S4 for a company known as EG&G on exotic technology. In this case, Bob Lazar worked on the propulsion system from a downed craft. Now, it wasn't the Roswell craft, but it was a similar kind of gadget, similar gizmo. So yeah, it's very interesting to me that, like I'm saying, in the space of 8,000 years, you have humans being the victim. Humans went from being the victim of nuclear weapons to owning them and holding the world hostage by them. And so the off-world interest comes back because it's history repeating itself. According to these same texts, we were a created race. We were not native here. We did not exist here until we were placed here by our makers. And now, especially like if you take into context the verse from the Tower of Babel, you know, behold, they have become like us, and now anything they seek to do, they will be capable of doing. It's very concerning. So we're so much like our makers that we have emulated them unconsciously, both in the fields of like atomic weaponry, and if you think about it in the terms of of uh, genetic engineering, we're coming up to the point where we're talking about genetically engineering our biome or our genome, excuse me. And we've already conducted experiments on lower intelligent life forms just to see what would happen. We fuck with fruit flies all the time. We fuck with rats. Uh, we fuck with pigs. We fuck with rabbits. You know, just to see what happens. Just to see what happens. So we're becoming very much like those who made us. And that's very concerning because those who made us were made to leave this planet partially because they made us and then wanted to mate with us. You see, so time's really coming around. The slinky, the great slinky of time is at a ring where it can look back on the other slinky that's most like it and start to recognize it for what it is. So yeah, this is all spurned by the movie Oppenheimer. It's in theaters right now. Go and see it. I'd recommend seeing it in 3D if you can. I tried to go see it in IMAX, but IMAX was sold out. But essentially, it's a great movie. I give it 5 out of 5 stars. Mostly because I have studied the subject very intensely. And part of what I do when I watch movies like this is I try to see if the writers and the directors have done their homework. The Nolans have done their homework. They tell a compelling drama just as good as all the Batman movies, if not better. They used practical effects 90% of the time, or maybe 98% of the time. I think there was only like the only instances of CG might have had to do with aging or de-aging actors to appear in their appropriate time periods. But the whole thing kind of is it's the inquiry of Dr. Oppenheimer at the occasion of the renewal of his Q clearance, which is required for him to remain in classified above top secret projects and to move about freely, essentially. And what we find out is that there are elements in the government that do not want him to become a nuclear weapons pacifist, because Oppenheimer was like a rock star back when he was living, and because he is cited as the man who invented the bomb, essentially, or the brains behind the bomb. He changed the world by the way he thought, and because everybody was affected by thoughts in his head at one point, he was placed on a very high pedestal. And especially after the bombings in Japan, he became a very conscientious objector to the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And it's along the lines of, look, at one time the United States had the biggest stick. Now the United States and Russia have equally big sticks, and I think this was before China was, So instead of all blowing ourselves up, why don't we just like throw away our sticks? And that's not good for the Defense Department. So they basically tried to set him up to be discredited by means of this security clearance review. And through this vehicle, Christopher Nolan is able to biographically tell the story as he understood it. And there's colorful characters, all the physics, like rock gods were there back then. It talks about Oppenheimer's personal life. It talks about some of how he might have perceived the universe. It talks about how he was as a student, how he was, how he came to live in the United States, his friendship with Einstein and people like that. It would have been interesting if Tesla was in there, but I don't think Tesla wanted us to fuck with the bomb at all. Actually, I know he didn't. There are quotes of Tesla's about him saying it's ridiculous to try to destroy God's creation, kind of thing, or to try to get energy out of destruction of God's creation. It's too bad. I would have liked to see Tesla. Robert Downey Jr. was very outstanding in his role in this movie. And I don't want to give too many spoilers. I just want to give enough to sort of put this stuff out there. But there were elements of this movie that really reminded me of JFK with Kevin Costner from 1991. There's those Batman sensibilities, kind of like that. There's a sort of like Forrest Gumpish element as far as like trips through time and like side stories and talking to people about things that once happened. But this is probably one of, like I said, Christopher Nolan's like career defining works, just as good, if not better, than the Batman movies. And if you have the means to do so, go and see it, especially if you're a fan of physics or if anything I said in this program was compelling. Like I said at the beginning, seeing this movie kind of set off a chain reaction in my head. And, you know, just like Russell Crowe in a Beautiful Mind, when like things click together and make sense in a way that I can dispense ancient wisdom or spiritual wisdom or even personal experiences to a mass audience, then I feel comfortable in going out and doing a broadcast. Because the only other things I've really been up to is like listening to UFO contactees and considering my own jaunts in the arena. So on that note, I'll go ahead and get out of your guys' ear. I've been yakking at you for about close to 1 3/4 hours. So if you will join me lifting high, whatever it is you are imbibing, and join me in the savage salute. Here's to us. What's like us? Not a goddamn thing. Stay savage, you guys.